Once upon a time, not so long ago and not so far away, I lived through what might be every professor's worst nightmare, at least pre-COVID-19. The semester started off great with students eager to learn, prepared for class, but about at midterms, 5 weeks into the semester, about where we are now, students started looking a little like this. But what it feels like from the front of the classroom is that it looks a little more like this, as if the undead have all decided to come to class on the same day. And I was faced with a fork in the road. How do I engage students and ignite learning? How do I invite students into an experience that helps them remember that learning is a full contact sport? I learned that retelling the story was one way that I could bring students into a shared experience. My favorite illustration of this concept occurred one day when I was telling the story of King David, a beloved king in Israel. King David, from his palace, saw a woman bathing on her rooftop. The woman's name was Bathsheba. David summons Bathsheba and sleeps with Bathsheba. And the first thing that Bathsheba utters in the narrative is, "I am pregnant." And so David summons Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, expecting him to provide a cover-up for what has happened in this situation. However, Uriah does not cross the threshold of his home out of solidarity with his comrades who are expanding the territory of David's kingdom. And when that doesn't work, David sends Uriah to the front lines. The story was going along as normal, except today, at this point in the story, one of my students responds, "Oh, shit." Am I allowed to say that at TED? Anyway, that was what the student said. And the student, I think, got right what was happening in this moment and was invested in the moment. And it inspired me to rethink how I engage my classes. When I tell these stories as if they're entertaining, even if somewhat problematic, and they are, and when I teach them as if there's something valuable to be gained from them, regardless of our faith or ethical traditions, and there is, I notice a palpable change in my classroom. The energy goes up. Students respond, they react, they smile, they laugh, and sometimes even swear. And sometimes they tell stories of their own in response. These stories are not just long ago and far away. They beg retelling, just like any good story. Education at its core is an act of storytelling. As professors, we tell stories that help invite our students into different experiences. We tell stories that explain the intricacies of the universe, whether through words or through formulas or through numbers. We tell stories that wrap our students in different times, different languages, different places. We tell stories of long ago and far away, of here and now, hoping that this will form our students into holistic, well-rounded individuals. This impulse is affirmed by the ancients. Teachers of rhetoric who would prepare students for public careers would advocate for storytelling as a vehicle for learning. It was able to ward off boredom and useful in forming moral citizens. Pseudo-Cicero, who wrote his rhetorical handbook Ad Herennium in the 1st century BCE, describes exactly what to do if your hearers become bored. He says, if your hearers have been fatigued by listening, we shall open with something that may provoke laughter, a fable, a plausible story, an ironical inversion based on the meaning of a word, an ambiguity, an innuendo, a banter, a naivete. You get the idea. I can't help but think that Pseudo-Cicero must have seen something akin to what I see in my classes as midterms approach. No matter how enticing I try to make the stories, I think no matter if I did backflips off the desk at the front of the room, I've not tried that yet, students don't seem compelled by the story. And to be fair, they're living off of barely any sleep, caffeine, and God knows what else. And at some point, they quit reading for class. I prefer not know how early that actually happens. I'm happy in my naivete here. But at some point, I faced a fork in the road. What was I to do? Should I double down and rage quiz my students into submission to read their assignments? Or should I find a different way to entice and invite and reform the way I think of story and of class? I clearly chose the latter. Retelling the story saved my class. One of the unintended benefits of this was I realized that it invited students into a shared learning experience. Even if students had read the assignment on their own, they had not yet been invited into a communal community around these texts, which is what story is, and it's what story does. It brings us into a shared learning experience which facilitates communal learning. It wards off boredom and is useful in forming our students into whole people. Part of the power of the oh shit story, as I affectionately remember it, is it reminded me to reform my classes because these stories are not just long ago and far away, they transcend time. A story about a king living in the 9th century in Israel could affect a student in such a way that they would verbally respond in class. These stories help us to remember that we are not alone. For example, if I asked you to tell your own story of a time that you could not see a way forward, perhaps you would share the who, the what, the when, and the where. But the why and the how, I would argue, involve an act of curiosity and of vulnerability. It invites us to find ways to make meaning where there seem to be no ways forward. It helps us to remember that even though it feels like the oh no moment is the end of the story, it's not. That's not true, because the story continues, but then. And if we can learn from others' but then moments, how they found ways forward, how they owned their mistakes, perhaps we can do the same. If we can learn from stories where humanity is shared and kindness bestowed, perhaps we can do the same. If stories that delight and appall us can teach us about the world and teach us how to respond to it with creativity, innovation, and generosity, then maybe retelling the story will not only save us from boredom and invite us into a shared learning experience. Maybe retelling the story will help us narrate our experiences to create a kinder, more curious, more generous, and less boring world. Thank you.